a lot to talk about. Let's get straight to our panel. Joining us from Charleston, South Carolina is James Brauchle. He's an aviation attorney at McClory Rice and a former U.S. Air Force navigator. Nawal Taneja joins us from Columbus, Ohio. He's an airline business strategist and aviation professor emeritus at Ohio State University. Mark Weiss is here in Washington. He's president of Weiss Consulting Group and a retired captain with American Airlines. And Dan McClory joins us from Irvine, California. He's managing director and head of China, Boustead Securities. Thank you to all of you for joining us. Mark, let's start right here in the studio. You are a former captain with American Airlines. When we look at these accidents that took place, I mean, we're told that this was a software glitch that brought down huge commercial airliners, the 737 MAX aircraft. Is this a software glitch, or are we looking at a bigger problem here?
Well, I think you have to step back and take a look at, obviously, what happened from the effect of the software glitch. Whether it was just a software glitch, lack of training, lack of information put out by Boeing or the airline, or they may not even have been aware of this. I think it's a combination of effects and events. Keeping in mind that aviation accidents generally do not happen from a single cause. It's a number of events or situations that lead up to a catastrophe, and I think that's what we're seeing here.
James, both the Indonesian plane and the Ethiopian plane experienced similar problems before they crashed. They were both on autopilot. Why was it so difficult? You've been a navigator, you've been in these planes. Why was it so difficult to disengage autopilot and manually start flying those planes?
Well, typically it's not difficult to disengage the autopilot. I think what's unique about this scenario, if in fact they're both related, is it wasn't just your normal way to disengage the autopilot. It was a separate system that was commanding the autopilot. And as your previous, as the captain was saying, it's a combination of different things. I think it mainly is it's a new system with this software glitch. And I think it goes back to training, that more than likely these pilots weren't properly trained on how to correct this problem if the problem existed.
Nawal Taneja, what is your assessment of what went wrong here? Boeing is talking of a software fix, as I mentioned, but is there really a more fundamental problem about how planes are manufactured and how they're tested today?
Well, the issue that's being looked at is there's so much data that's being generated by various systems using the advanced technologies in airplanes that do the pilots have a deep understanding of the role and understanding of the role of this technology and how to handle it. That's what's being looked at. If the data is wrong, then should the pilot be able to shut it off and fly? Or is the data correct? And not in this case, but in general, if the data is correct and the pilot is misreading it, should the pilot not be allowed to do it? So there are much more fundamental issues that, that we can look at in terms of how to deal with this advanced technology.
And what, both our previous guests mentioned training. What do you think that these pilots had enough training, or was it too cursory? I mean, in one instance, we heard that training was carried out on an iPad. Didn't last very long.
Yeah, it's not that the pilots are not trained to fly airplanes. Obviously, they are professional people. They have enough training. The issue is that do they need deeper training with the use of this new advanced technology that's being built into the current generation of airplanes, in this case MAX that we're talking about. Right. And if there is going to be retraining, or I should say deeper training rather than retraining, who is going to determine that? And that to me looks like is going to have to be a collaboration of the aircraft manufacturer, the airline, the government regulator, the pilots that are flying it, but it's all around the data is centered around the data as to how we're going to look at this data. Is the data correct or is the data wrong? And if it's wrong, can it be looked at it from a different set too? Should there be two types of data that can collab, which is what they're doing right now, is that if the angle of attack coming from one side was different than the other one, but there was no other one. They only had one from what I understand, they only had one information coming in.
All right, let me bring in Dan McClory. Dan, all Boeing 727 MAX planes have now been grounded in the United States as well as in other countries around the world. This is how Boeing responded to the tragedy. This is what one of its spokesmen said. Let's watch.
The 737 is a safe airplane. The 737 family is a safe airplane family. And the 737 MAX builds on that tremendous history of safety that we've seen for the last almost 50 years. Our hearts go out to all of the loved ones and friends and family of the people that were lost. We mourn this loss of life, and we're going to do everything that we can do to ensure that accidents like these never happen again.
So Dan, what do you make of that response from Boeing? Because it doesn't seem like Boeing has taken responsibility or said they're sorry for what happened.
Well, to my knowledge, they haven't. But I think it comes down to restoring trust. And of course, we're famous about saying trust, but verify. So a really good first step has been the disclosure of perhaps it's in the software. I think the unknown causes more angst than being able to identify something that it could be, and it's not been conclusively determined that that's it. But I also think this shows kind of a difference and a contrast from maybe a purely commercial approach to a much more leadership approach like we've seen coming out of China, where there was no commercial consideration given. They were immediately grounded. And there wasn't waiting for different companies to respond. It was, no, we're going to ground the planes. We're going to figure it out. We'll let you know. Now, that takes guts. And that doesn't happen in every country and every culture and every system. So that puts the commercial consideration off to the side and really just deals with how are we going to find out what the problem is and resolve it. So I think that will ultimately cause Boeing, of course, to dig further, dig deeper, come up with what the thesis of the problem is. But until they do, those planes, as far as China goes and many other countries, are not going to be flying.
Mark Weiss, the United States has a regulatory authority to ensure air safety known as the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA as it's better known. Now, it's responsible for certifying plane safety. Now, we find out in this case that the FAA actually outsourced safety testing to, guess whom? Boeing. There's something wrong with that, isn't there?
Well, you know, take a step back for a moment and recognizing the fact that the aircraft manufacturers, whether it's Boeing or Airbus or Embraer, they're the experts in putting this aircraft together. They have the technology, they have the resources, the financial pockets behind this to make these aircraft happen.
Right.
The government has experts, but certainly not in the amount that that maybe we would like now, you know, looking in hindsight. So we rely very heavily on industry, but it's a cooperative effort. You can't just say that Boeing alone did this. It's been a cooperative effort. Take a step back for a moment and recognize the huge safety record that the aviation industry has had with primarily Boeing and Airbus aircraft.
Right.
And I think you can say, look, sometimes you don't know that there's a real problem until there's a problem.
But in this instance, I mean, of course, politics has got involved here as well. One senator said it effectively puts the fox in charge of the hen house.
Well, yeah, and I guess it does in some ways. But there's, you know, and that's probably going to be changing, or at least to some degree, it's going to be shifting responsibilities back to the FAA. There'll probably be more oversight from that agency. And I think there's going to be more coordination with the EASA, the CAAC, when we certificate aircraft in the future.
Right. James, something else that should be of concern to us is something that came out of the United Kingdom. The head of the Flight Safety Committee there says airplanes and manufacturers are keeping safety training to a, quote, absolute minimum under pressure to keep costs low. Are companies like Boeing sacrificing safety for profits?
A lot of it all does come down to economics. I mean, as we were talking earlier, you were talking about the FAA piece, and the FAA regulates, you know, what's mandatory, what's required on the airplane, and that's what they're going to provide and equip that airplane with. The problem is, in this case, with these two recent crashes, perhaps these angle of attack indicators or warning lights could have prevented the two accidents. I mean, we don't know because we're still waiting, but those were things that were optional. And so, two things: it costs Boeing less money to put those in, and they can also make more money if the airlines or whoever's ordering the jet pays for them. We see it all the time in the business that I am, where we look at manufacturing defects and product defects. Many times it comes down to simple economics, and that's unfortunate. Money over safety.
All right, and James, you also represent some of the families of the victims in the Ethiopian air crash, right?
That's correct.
Yeah, what's the next step for them? What are they looking for?
Right now, all they're looking for is answers, and most of the victims and families that I've dealt with over the years, that's their biggest quest, is to find out what happened and why this happened. As the captain was saying earlier, it's usually not one thing; it's a series of different events. In aviation accident investigation, they call it the Swiss cheese model, where all the holes in the cheese of all the different events have to line up for an accident to happen. And that's their biggest quest right now, is why their loved one died and how did it happen and how could it have been prevented.
Okay, Nawal Taneja, people are looking for answers right now, and where does the blame for this go? Federal aviation officials or Boeing or both? We heard from Elaine Chao, the U.S. Secretary for Transportation. This is what she said. Let's listen.
Well, it's not just the aircraft. Oh, go ahead.
One moment. I just want to play you this clip. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay.
I am, of course, concerned about any allegations of coziness with any company, manufacturer, whatever. The FAA is a professional organization. There are 44,000 people working at the FAA whose main mission every day is to ensure the safety of our traveling public. But these questions, when they arise, if they arise, are troubling, because we should have absolute confidence in the regulators that they are certifying properly.
So, Nawal Taneja, is Ms. Chao being a little bit disingenuous there, casting blame on an agency that actually falls directly under her jurisdiction?
Well, what was stated is true, that it's a very professional organization. But the question that we're looking at is, before we start blaming, is it the aircraft manufacturer or is it the federal government? It's a collaborative effort that needs to be looked at. When an aircraft comes out, of course, the manufacturer gives you a manual. Now, an airline can decide that that manual will just accept it and send it to the government regulator, or they can modify it and say that based on our experience, a larger airline will modify it, and then the modified version goes to the government for approval. So what's needed here is, as I said earlier, is a collaboration between at least four: the government regulator, the manufacturer, the airline, and the pilot, to say how much training is needed. This thing about the difference in training between the regular 800 and the MAX, there was a difference training, but how much difference training is needed? Is it just, as you pointed out, somebody said that it was just simply using an iPad, or is it more going into the simulator? I don't think it's a reasonable assumption to say let's just point the finger either at the government regulator or at the manufacturer. There are two other groups involved: the airline and the pilots.
Dan McClory, you were talking a moment ago about China, and China grounded its 737 MAX fleet after these accidents. What's next for China? I mean, does China just accept the software fix and move on, or will they be looking for something more?
Certainly looking for something more. Of course, they've also suspended the ongoing certification of different craft that are awaiting the ability to fly. They're conducting their own independent investigations. They're certainly going to rely heavily on Boeing, whatever they come up with. But let's not forget the commercial reality of all this. You know, these production lines of planes, whether it's Airbus or Boeing, they're literally sold out years in advance. This is a point-in-time occurrence, but it hasn't yet disrupted those production lines. They're going to continue on. China needs something like 7,000 aircraft over the next 20 years. So Boeing's going to have to get this right. The world is too dependent on Boeing for it not to get this right, and we think they will. But in the meantime, I will once again say that China's taken a leadership position in deciding very quickly and very tactically, all this is going to stop until we're satisfied, even if there's short-term commercial hurt to their fleets, to their passengers. And that's quite remarkable and quite striking in today's day and age.
Mark, another thing that we're hearing, and it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, is that these safety features that Boeing are now installing, these software fixes, they were sold, or offered rather, as extras, as optional extras.
Well, that's what I understand as well, and expensive extras as well. But you know, safety items are a pretty big category.
Right.
We're talking about, we now consider this particular item a safety of flight item. Think of it that way, as opposed to, say, taking another fire extinguisher and adding it to the onboard aircraft.
Yeah.
That's another safety item. So you're really going to have to start to categorize and break it down as to what is a safety of flight that can actually change the flight envelope of an aircraft, as to something that may be nice to have and still come under a broader category of safety item.
James, talking about training, what kind of training do pilots go through for situations like this? And does a company like Boeing, or even Airbus for that matter, do they have any control over the training a pilot has while flying one of their planes?
A lot of times they do. The manufacturers will work with the airlines, or most of the airlines a lot of times contract out with third-party companies like Flight Safety or CAE that run simulators and run exams. And typically they do have a Boeing or an Airbus, one of the manufacturer representatives that are on hand that kind of can give guidance with training and answer questions and assistance with the different systems. Most of the training, at least for emergencies and systems, a lot of times are done in the simulator, where you can make things fail. You can have abnormalities that you can't actually do in the airplane.
Mark, would these pilots have gone through that kind of training in a simulator to say, well, look, the software is faulty right now, what do we do?
Well, obviously they hadn't. They didn't even know that it existed. That's my understanding. But when you come to training like that, you can't provide training for every particular situation. However, when you get a new part of an aircraft, a new piece of equipment on an airplane that really changes the flight characteristics, you can't just give somebody a handout and say, this is how it's done. People need to be trained. And again, here in the United States, because of the history, we have a general aviation where pilots go through the ranks or through the military and take thousands of hours before they can sit into the seat of a commercial airliner. That's not necessarily the case around the globe. So experience is one thing. There's a lot of training. I mean, it's training, training, training when you get on with an airline, at least in the United States. And it's critical because every day you're tested, and you have to feel comfortable when you get into that airplane.
Right. Nawal Taneja, getting back to an issue we talked about a moment ago, and that's outsourcing safety tests to the companies themselves. And it brings up a point that Mark mentioned. The FAA says that it would need 10,000 more employees and up to $1.8 billion to do that work themselves. That is a big challenge, isn't it?
Absolutely. And then it gets down to the costs, which we have talked about in some indirect ways and some indirect ways. At some point, there has to be a trade-off of the costs and benefits. And as tragic as these two accidents were, and I'm the first one to admit, real tragedy, but you got to look at the thousands and thousands and thousands of airplanes that are flying. And these are still very rare instances when these accidents do happen. So one has to look at it as to, based on this, how much do we focus in it? It does show that we do have to develop deeper understanding of technology, and I keep saying that the pilots know how to fly airplanes, there's no question about it. But do they understand how this technology works? And what is the technology that even has been built into it? And just, if an airplane is sold on the idea that is very similar to the airplanes that you have had in the past, well, then that raises the question that, is that true? Do the pilots think that is similar, or are there significant differences in the technology that has been built into it?
So, Nawal, do you think people are going to have a few more concerns right now about automation in aircraft? We hear a lot about artificial intelligence, that these planes can fly by themselves. Are people going to ask the airline companies, airline manufacturers, to take a step back right now and take another look at this?
Well, the technology, there are some questions raised that are the airplanes having too much technology? I don't think so, because this technology is needed. It provides all kinds of benefits, not just the economic benefits, but in terms of customer experience for passengers as well, and as well as operating costs and fuel and the flight levels and so on. But the part is that the idea is not to eliminate the technology. The idea is to learn how to use technology.
Yeah.
And will technology never fail? Not at all. They have been instances in the past, and these two happen.
Right.
And I'm sure there'll be other instances that are going to take place. But those are very, very rare events. And even they can be minimized by additional training.
Right. Dan McClory, I've just got about 40 seconds left. Is this going to hurt Boeing? I'm not talking about lawsuits or anything like that here, but it's business. I mean, we just had China inked a deal in Paris for, 300 Airbus planes.
Yeah, I mean, that $34 billion transaction that Mr. Xi brought to Macron was extremely noteworthy, but let's face it, that deal was in the works for some time. As I mentioned earlier, the production lines for both Airbus and Boeing literally sold out years in advance. There is certainly going to be a short-term or a medium-term impact and a negative effect on Boeing, but the world, including China, is too dependent on Boeing for aircraft for all of their fleets. This is going to get sorted, and the company will eventually rebound, but it's taken some short-term hurt right now for sure.
Okay, and that's where we're going to have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.